to go ahead and start recording. So welcome once again to Dr. Alan Molk, who is presenting about his important book, Saving Lives, Saving Dignity.
Thank you again, Rabbi. Sorry, I'm waving my operated hand to everyone where I had my surgery. I actually have a healthy hand on the other side. And again, thanks so much for the opportunity to do this presentation. I would request that, Rabbi, that you kind of moderate this a little bit at the end with people asking questions on the chat. And at the end, I seriously invite anyone who'd like to ask questions, please do so. And also, if you have stories to share, I find storytelling every bit as amazing and as compelling as the presentation itself. So anyone who has stories to share about any experiences they've had with end of life in their personal experience, please do so at the end. Okay, so we'll get started. You see a picture of me and my cousin, Dr. Robert Shapiro. He is a physician in California, and we wrote this book together starting a couple of years ago, and this is the second edition. A little intro about myself. Some of you know me reasonably well from The Wise Aging. I do not consider myself the average emergency room physician. Firstly, I'm a father of triplets, Esha, Ariel, and Eliza. The picture on the right is one of me taken of them when they were all at the U of A at a Costco in Tucson, when I would make frequent trips down there to provide them with necessities while they were in school. My only one who's married is Eliza, and you're looking at the chuppah that was taken in La Jolla. You will notice the rabbi has a resemblance to Rabbi Book, and the reason that is that it happens to be Rabbi Book's brother who performed the ceremony. An interesting coincidence. And to the right is my amazing wife, Laura. She's an attorney, or we call her the lawyer Laura. I'm an avid Red Sox fan, as you can probably tell by my presence in Fenway Park in the top picture. The bottom picture is me in Manhattan, giving the thumbs down to all the Yankee fans. I'm also a little bit of a Meshuggah, as you can tell from some of my shenanigans. At Christmas time, I always work over Christmas and I play the accordion. I play Christmas carols, everything from Silent Night to White Christmas to Jingle Bells for all my Christian friends, and they love it. I do it every year because I always work on Christmas as well. And yes, I like to have fun. I like shenanigans. I'm a huge fan of laughter and humor. It is good for our money. Let me try that again. Our body, our minds, and our souls. I've always been viewed as the eternal optimist, a jokester. I was always the class clown in medical school. And I love to create humor and cheering up people. And people who've known me all these years to this day cannot believe that I co-authored a book that covers such a serious but yet important topic. So what prompted me to write this book? Well, mostly it was my mother's journey with Alzheimer's, my beloved mother, Serona Molk. And you see her gravestone, as she's buried right here in Phoenix at the Mount Sinai Cemetery, not far from here. And I actually started writing this book before she passed away. And I did this as a catharsis to deal with her deteriorating condition and the grief I was going through. She was the most harmless, the most positive person I ever knew. She truly was my role model. It was never about her. It was always about others. And she would never, ever have wanted to be a burden on me or on a family. But yet her worst nightmare materialized. A quick reminder, a sobering reminder that life as we know it on earth has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Many of we physicians still look at death as the ultimate enemy. And I think we've spoken about this before. But to many patients and their loved ones, death comes as a friend. After a lingering illness, which is often accompanied by horrible suffering, death often comes as a huge relief to the surviving loved ones. I can tell you that, and I think I've mentioned this before in one of the previous sessions, that when my brother and I drove back from my mother's funeral, we just the only two children, I was sitting next to him, I was driving, he lives in New Jersey. I looked at him after the funeral, I said to him, is it just me? Or do you feel perhaps a huge sense of relief? And he looked at me and he said, absolutely.
What's the matter, Ben?
Sorry?
Nothing.
Okay. I'm quoting here Dr. Christian Barnard, who was the first cardiac surgeon to do the first heart transplant. And he quotes that he truly believed that death is a good treatment because it can achieve what medical advances in technologies cannot achieve today, and that is to stop the suffering of the patient. This is a direct quote from Dr. Molk. I will tell you, some of you may remember him. He did the first in 1967 in Cape Town. His first patient was a gentleman named Louis Washkansky, a Jewish guy. And I was still in South Africa at the time, and he lived about 3 weeks. And I'll never forget seeing Christian Barnard at the funeral with a yarmulke. The second heart transplantation who Dr. Barnard operated on was also a Jewish guy named Dr. Philip Bleiberg, who was a retired dentist. This is just some interesting cardiac transplant trivia that I thought you might find interesting. Just a reminder that not everybody makes it to a ripe old age. And I recall visiting my mother's grave once, and I took a walk around her burial site in the cemetery, and I was really struck by how many people didn't even make it to 60. And if you read the Sunday obituaries, you'll be reminded of this as well. Here are some famous people who all died young. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Marilyn Monroe, Jim Morrison of the Doors, Eva Peron, JFK Jr., Buddy Holly, and Amy Winehouse. There are many more, but these are just some famous ones that come to mind. A survey was taken of physicians about where they wanted to be at the end of their lives. And the number was quite compelling. 80% wanted to be at home, surrounded by family and friends. That's 4 out of 5.
Can you reach the tissue?
And yet, we as physicians have a double standard. Many of our patients still end up and die in the ICU. And they are receiving aggressive, heroic, yet often futile care that does little but prolong the inevitable and needless suffering. This is a book by a woman named Moira Allen. She talks about coping with our pets who are end of life. And she talks about how we consider, when we think about the quality and the dignity of our furry friends. Mobility, not eating, not breathing right, appearing uncomfortable or in pain, becoming incontinent, loss of mental capacity, not appearing happy, not responding well to veterinary treatment, and we come to a decision. And out of love, we gently and lovingly put our animal to sleep, who is end of life. So I have to ask myself, and this is not meant to be I'm not meaning to promote euthanasia here. I'm just mentioning this because I have to think to myself, why don't we, when we see this in our loved ones, talk about dignified end of life for our loved ones? I will give you a real life example of where, personal real life example, and I have many others, where aggressive care was regretted by the surviving loved one. It was a friend of mine, his name isn't David, we'll just call him David. He doesn't belong to Temple High. A number of years ago, his mother had an aneurysm in her chest, a thoracic aortic aneurysm, which is much more complicated and difficult to operate on than abdominal aortic aneurysm, which is actually relatively uncomplicated surgery. She was in her 80s. They knew that ultimately this aneurysm would rupture and it would be a rapid death, but they didn't know when. It could have been a few years. However, after consulting here with several physicians, it was opted to operate on her. And they felt that the best place to send her was out of state. So they went out of state. She had the surgery. She had a prolonged, somewhat stormy post-operative course, but she ultimately did get well enough to come back home. She was never quite the same. She was weaker. She was more frail. And David would go visit his mother 3 times a week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, whatever days. And then approximately 2 weeks after she came home, he went to go take her to lunch, knocked on the door. There was no answer. He had a key. He opened the door, and there was his mother deceased on the floor. And we had a discussion about this a couple of weeks later, and he told me, gee, I really wish I never put my mother through this. I know this is Monday morning quarterback. I know this is hindsight, but she could have lived another 2-3 years and not have gone through this. And he felt a sense of regret and guilt. There are many, many other examples where people have regretted going the route of aggressive care. Many patients, when given the option of ongoing aggressive care or less aggressive and more comfort care, aggressive care would, for example, include this gentleman on dialysis on the left, or more comfort care, which that person there is Barbara Bush. She opted to go the route of comfort care. Many people would choose B when given the explanation and being educated about where they're at in their current condition. Definition of dignity. It's a state or quality of being worthy of honor and respect. I see it basically related to quality of life. It's a first cousin to quality of life. Of course, quality of life and dignity do mean different things for different people. What some people will accept as an acceptable quality of life and acceptable dignity may not be acceptable to another person. So this is very much an individual decision and individual choice. How important is dignity? Well, a survey was taken of physicians, and this question was a large survey, was posed. What single life-changing event would indicate that you have had a serious compromise in your dignity? And the answer? The inability to wipe yourself after a bowel movement. And this could be a game changer in decision-making. Sadly, so many diseases strip us of our dignity. Alzheimer's, other forms of dementia, stage 4 cancer, end-stage congestive heart failure, end-stage emphysema, end-stage liver disease, diabetes with multiple diabetic complications, Lou Gehrig's disease, other degenerative diseases such as advanced Parkinson's, MS, and there are many more, and advanced frailty. A word about frailty, and this is where we can be a little bit proactive. Frailty implies a significant loss of muscle mass, which makes you weak, which makes you unstable, which can unfortunately lead to falls, resulting in fractures that are not minor, hip fractures, shoulder fractures, spinal fractures, and serious head injuries. So my thought of the day for all of you is if you're going to live long enough, you're going to become frail to some extent, but avoiding frailty and trying to stave it off by eating well, eating healthy diets, exercising, doing core training, doing some gentle muscle weight training, all will help the advancement of frailty, because frailty is absolutely also associated with an unfavorable overall prognosis. Well, talking about end-of-life care does seem somewhat counterintuitive for someone like myself who's been an emergency room doctor for 40 years. And I say that because counterintuitive, meaning contrary to intuition, to common sense, but often nonetheless true. Because as an ER doctor, what do we love? What do we live for? We love an adrenaline rush. We love resuscitating and stabilizing ill and injured patients. We love intubating, putting people on ventilators, putting in chest tubes, putting in central lines, all invasive stuff. We love being diagnostic sleuths. We love saving lives. But we also loathe certain things. We dislike certain things. I hate seeing a full waiting room because that just reminds me we're behind. We need to get these patients back so we can take care of them. We're very type A about wanting to take care of patients in an expedited way as possible. We loathe a resuscitation that is not successful. We loathe being unable to fix patients. We hate missing a diagnosis. And we are wired not to give up. We are wired to absolutely feel a sense of failure if we lose a patient. And we also have many challenges. We have to accept that many patients and their families often have limited knowledge, which makes our jobs more challenging. So many patients I see have no idea what medications they're on and don't have a list of it. And they could be on 50 different medications, or could have been hospitalized many times for different diseases or operations and have poor recollection about it. And we have to be very creative as to how we often collect the information that is relevant. And this is an enormous challenge about how limited the knowledge is of so many people in the lay public. We also reluctantly have to accept a few other things. We have to reluctantly accept that we cannot mend the ills of society. Unemployment, mental illness, depression, domestic violence, homelessness, and drug abuse. However, we do take comfort and pride knowing that we are the safety net of the world. Anyone can come to the ER at any time for anything and have a right to be seen. There is a federal mandate for this called EMTALA without an appointment. So anyone who feels unwell, it could be something minor like a stubbed toe or something major like a stroke, can present themselves to an ER and we are there for them. We are the safety net. So how did I develop this interest and passion in end-of-life care and palliative and hospice care, given my passion for many years, which involves taking care of sick patients in the ER? Well, in addition to my mother's journey, the face of emergency medicine has changed drastically over the last 30 years or so. The obesity and the diabetes epidemic and the resulting complications have drastically affected the type of patients we now see in the ER. It is, you actually would have to, if any of you spent a day shadowing me, you'll see in the ER, you'll know exactly what I mean. Patients over the last 30 years have become sicker, disease processes more complex. We have a higher aging population and many patients with numerous comorbidities. Comorbidities meaning not just one condition, but 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 different medical conditions that the patient is being seen for. And we are seeing the unintended consequences of medical science to prolong life. If anyone has any questions about that, we can talk about that later. But these are truly unintended consequences that we are now seeing. I found that too much is being done for too many patients with poor quality of life for too long. The loss of human dignity and worsening of quality of life has become very obvious. And I began to realize that much of what we are doing in the medical world is morally probably wrong. It's certainly inhumane. It is unkind, and in many instances isn't even good medical care. I talk about the revolving door of the ER. Every day, every single day in the ER, we see numerous patients who technically could be considered end of life and who really don't belong in the ER, but instead should receive hospice or palliative care where they can be served and treated in a more appropriate and dignified way. And there are numerous life examples given in my book. There are several cases that I discuss that will illustrate and make you understand and feel the impact of this problem. I'll give you an example of 3 patients I saw within a 2-hour period. Again, I've changed things around a little bit. A woman with multiple complaints, age 70, but she looks 90. Her medical conditions include pulmonary embolus, which is blood clot to the lungs, peripheral arterial disease, bad circulation, breast cancer, diabetes, emphysema, kidney stones, abdominal aortic aneurysm, severe arthritis, anxiety, depression, I would be too, severe coronary vessel disease, and she lives alone. This is not an uncommon scenario. The second example is a male just 60. He's retired military. He's morbidly obese. He fell on his side. He hurt his rib cage. He's on a blood thinner, which makes him prone to bleeding. He has atrial fibrillation, which is not necessarily a good condition. He felt like he broke some ribs. He's had a previous stroke. He's weak on his left side. He's had a pacemaker. He's had stents in his coronary arteries for severe blocked coronary arteries. He's got cardiomyopathy, a weak heart muscle, also anxiety and depression, also severe arthritis, also diabetes, sleep apnea, and he's on dialysis. Of course, that day he also turned out to have a few fractured ribs to add to his misery. This is a widowed 92-year-old male, just discharged from the hospital 2 days earlier with pneumonia and congestive heart failure. Today he came in because he fell. He was frail. Fortunately, he had no serious injuries, but he has memory loss. He's got emphysema. He also has atrial fibrillation. He's got an enlarged prostate. He has issues with that. He's accompanied by his family, who didn't feel they could ever take care of him, and they wanted to place him in a skilled nursing facility. The patient himself refused. He said, I want to go home. I want to go back to my own place. And we see this also all too often in elderly people who don't want to be stripped of their independence. And we see these type of patients every single day in the ER. You know, these type of patients were much rarer 30 years ago. Now they become the norm. We don't really cure them. We band-aid them. And we band-aid the situation. Occasionally, some of these patients do have a treatable or reversible problem. They may have like a gallbladder attack, take out the appendix, take out the gallbladder, I'm sorry, that is reversible. I also never cease to be amazed when I talk about how certain things have become a norm. When I ask a 300-pound patient who sprained their ankle, and I say to them, do you have any other medical problems? And they respond by, no, I'm perfectly healthy. I'm in good health. The mindset of our lay population has changed, and it has not changed for the better. This part is a little hard for me to talk about because I may get teary. But one day I was visiting my mother in her advanced Alzheimer's stage. She was sitting in a memory care center in a wheelchair, not recognizing me, not eating, staring into space. And every time I went to visit her, it was so painful. But one day I had what I call a crystal ball epiphany. And this is what it was. I pretended that I had a crystal ball in my hand, and it was 6 years earlier, before my mother developed Alzheimer's dementia. And I would have said to her, Mom, look into this crystal ball. This is what you're going to look like 6 years from now. Seeing her that day in that current state where she was totally stripped of her dignity. And what would she have said? I can tell you what she would have said. She would have said, oh, no, 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 no. If that ever happens, please push me over a cliff.
Yeah.
And I recall one of the last things I recall my mother saying before, when she still had a little bit of insight left and she began to realize what was happening to her, she became a little tearful and she said to me, Alan, I'm so sorry that I've become a burden on you. And of course, my only response at that time was, of course, you're not a burden, Mom. I love you so much. You've taken care of me. I'm happy to take care of you. But she never would have wanted that. She took such a pride in her independence and her appearance. And then Alzheimer's stripped her of all that. Sorry. Well, there is a flip side of the coin. And there are situations where family and loved ones consider it an honor, a privilege, and a duty, and a mitzvah to take care of an aging parent or loved ones. And this is, of course, not a burden. It's a mitzvah, it's wonderful, and it's praiseworthy. I talk also about what I call the professional patient. And that is when your life and your existence is to be a full-time patient. You go from one specialist to another, from one hospital to another, from one form of treatment to another, and that is about your life. I certainly wouldn't want this, and I certainly would never want to be a burden on my family. So I pose a question. How about you? Think about it. Let's talk about us, the baby boomers. Some of us in this, many of us here are baby boomers, and we need a reality check, folks. Our numbers are rising. Those retiring are rising. I'm one of them. In June, I'm going to be retiring. It's been shown that in about 9 years, healthcare for us baby boomers is going to be a daunting task. Some of you may know this, that up to 30% of Medicare dollars are spent in the last 6 months of life keeping people alive. And we nearly need to think about the sustainability of these numbers. Many of us are unhealthy and have let ourselves go. We are part of the diabetes and obesity epidemic. And yet we want everything done and we feel like we deserve it because we've helped make this country what it is. But do we deserve everything, considering years and decades of self-destructive and unhealthy habits? I'm asking this brutally, it's a kind of a brutal question. And many healthcare experts note that we are going over the fiscal cliff due to an unsustainable healthcare program. What are we leaving behind? A bankrupt system? Is that fair on the next generations? We need a dose of reality. We owe it to our children and grandchildren to leave the world sustainable. This includes issues with pollution, climate change, the ecology, and a healthcare system that is sustainable. Let's debunk some myths now. You see the boogeyman there in front of the window. He's a myth, right? Doctors are gods. No, we're not. We're human and mortal like everybody else. And as hard as we try, we cannot reverse the aging process. Another myth, you just saw Bigfoot run past your screen. Doctors can cure everything. No, we cannot. Yes, we can cure certain things, strep throat, bladder infections, TB, certain early detectable cancers, but there are many diseases we cannot cure. Alzheimer's, ALS, stage 4 cancer, just being 3 examples. what we mostly do is what's called disease management. That is not curing, that's just managing diseases. We cannot cure kidney failure, but we've got dialysis. We cannot cure diseased coronary arteries, but we have stents and bypass surgery. We cannot cure strokes, but we have clot busters. We cannot cure asthma or emphysema, but we have all kinds of inhalers. Cannot cure diabetes, but yep, we've got insulin, we've got metformin. We cannot cure mental illness, but we have Prozac and we have counseling available. So it's important that the lay public understands that much of what you do is in fact not curing, but just managing diseases and just band-aiding them much of the time. There goes the tooth fairy, another myth. The doctors save lives all the time. Yeah. But it's happened mostly in Hollywood, in shows like ER, Chicago Hopes, and elsewhere in Grey's Anatomy. In the real world, we occasionally save lives. We occasionally save stab wounds, bad car accidents, people with serious heart arrhythmias with pacemakers and defibrillators. We save certain overdoses. Some people who take overdoses regret being saved because they were hoping to make it a terminal suicidal event. And yes, we can help with certain obstetrical complications, pneumonia. We can get certain patient off ventilators. So these are just some examples where we do in fact save lives. There's the monster under the bed. Transplants are a cure. Well, they certainly, in some people, do make a huge difference and add and give people an additional lease on life, but it's not like treating a hangnail. These patients have to be on strong immunosuppressant therapy, which can make the immune system compromised. And of course, organ rejections do happen and the organ transplantation turned out to be a failure. Here's another myth, that hospice and palliative care are equivalent to death panels and suggest that we are giving up on the patient. That's a myth. In fact, hospice and palliative care is compassionate care for patients and family who are suffering. Here's another myth, that having the conversation about end-of-life care, end-of-life wishes, advanced directives will traumatize and scar you for life. No, it won't. On the contrary, the very opposite is true, that you'll be glad you had the conversation. Let's talk about what palliative care is not. It is not about pulling the plug. It's not about euthanasia. It's not about death panels. Myths all the way. What it is compassionate care for families and patients who are suffering with the emphasis on symptom management, something that often falls by the wayside. By that I mean, if you're in pain, your pain will be controlled. If you're nauseated and vomiting, you'll get medication that will control that. If you're anxious, you'll get anxiety medications. If you're constipated, they'll get treated. If you need oxygen, short of breath, you get your oxygen to make you comfortable. So it's all about making the person comfortable. It's also a team approach. A palliative care team consists of doctors, pharmacists, social workers, chaplains, nurses. It is a whole team approach. And it talks about the goals of care. What are your wishes? What should we do that's going to make your situation as good as possible? And it's about respecting patients' wishes. That's all beautiful. Palliative care is specialized medical care for people with serious and life-limiting illnesses. It addresses, as we mentioned, the physical, intellectual, emotional, social, and the spiritual needs of patients, their families. And it's appropriate at any age. This is even available in children's hospitals for children who have tragic, unfortunate terminal illnesses. It can also be used on someone who's getting, for example, cancer treatment with a hope of putting them in remission. A very high percentage of patients in palliative care do ultimately, however, transition into hospice care. Hospice of the Valley being the biggest one here, one of the biggest in the country, but there are other very good hospice organizations as well here in the Phoenix area. Hospice is a paid medical benefit for a patient with a prognosis of 6 months or less. It gets covered. And the indications for hospice care are the same as for palliative care. As we mentioned earlier, end-stage cancer, end-stage heart disease, end-stage dementia, and end-stage neurological conditions. I will tell you that we do get hospice nurses come to the ER from time to time where patients go straight from the ER into hospice care. And the biggest, when I talk to them, the biggest complaint the hospice nurses have is, gee, I wish we were called sooner. We could have done so much more. Because the average survival in hospice is usually just days, and it really should be longer than that. And all it takes to get hospice care is to place a call, and they come over. They are extremely responsive and helpful. A brief talk about medical aid in dying. It's a controversial topic. It's not legal in Arizona, but it's legal in several other states, all of which are, by the way, blue states, Democrat-run states. But many other states are working to get this passed. It's a totally separate discussion. It's controversial. Whoever would like to talk to me about it later is welcome to do so, but it's a topic on its own. Now, all this may sound counterintuitive, but I am not a maverick, I'm not a rogue, I'm not a renegade, and I'm not a dirty, rotten scoundrel. And I'm not a crook. I have the backing of the American College of Emergency Physicians and the American Medical Association, who have made it clear that patients who would benefit or would need palliative and hospice care, that we should be using these services. Definitely have the endorsement of the AMA and the American College of Emergency Physicians. These are proven benefits of palliative and hospice care. Improve the symptoms, improve the quality of life. Many of these patients actually live longer. The family are happier. The family bereavement outcomes are way better, much less PTSD. We match the patient to goals. We avoid unnecessary costs for unnecessary hospitalizations and ICU. We maintain dignity, and we try to ensure a dignified death. You know, some people ultimately become sick and tired of being sick and tired. And many do welcome the opportunity of having a conversation about the goals of care. So, how about a conversation? Those of you who haven't had it, have it. You'll be glad you did. And if your doctor doesn't have a conversation with you, be your own advocate, be proactive. Set up an appointment to talk to your doctor and your loved one's prognosis and the treatment options. And become educated and knowledgeable about invasive and life-altering treatments, such as being on a ventilator, being on dialysis, getting a transplant, or being oxygen dependent for life. There's so much that's available out there, even on YouTube, that would make you knowledgeable and help you make decisions about what aggressive care you either want or don't want. Do your own diligence, and you'll be glad you did. Talk to your family. Talk to your doctor. Talk to your lawyer, your estate planning lawyer. And talk to your rabbi. Having the conversation could be awkward and uncomfortable in the beginning, but I guarantee you, you'll be glad you did. These are various resources. I know Rabbi Capella is familiar with them. The Conversation Product out of Boston, Compassion and Choices, based largely in Denver. Thoughtful Life Conversation that's based right here in Arizona, that have all kinds of resources and educational pieces to do further education on the subject. And this happens to be a website of Xavier Becerra, who is now been appointed by the Biden administration to a higher post, but he was the Attorney General. But you can go on the State of Arizona website and Google forms regarding power of attorney, and you can fill out these forms, you can download them, you can print them, and you can give them to your attorney. They're very straightforward. That's one really good way to do it. Now, to make end-of-life and palliative hospice care more commonplace and less taboo, we need a culture change, both in the medical world and in the real world. We need to educate and enlighten people. We need people to take a willingness to accept and embrace end-of-life and understand that these are excellent options, compassionate, caring, and humane. We have to understand that offering this doesn't mean we're giving up, because the concept of dignified death is still foreign to many. And as I mentioned earlier, we still see losing a patient as a failure and death as the enemy. And we in the medical community are part of the problem. This happened in Arizona a couple of years ago, where 2 palliative care docs were fired because other specialists, oncologists in particular, complained that they were interfering with the care of the cancer patients. Unthinkable, but this happened. Much of this has to do with the inability to say goodbye. But I can tell you without a shadow of doubt that saying goodbye can be the ultimate act of love. We see this with our beloved pets, who we have to say goodbye to because we love them. I also encourage you all to embrace spirituality. It has definitely been my experience that people who are connected to a higher power do much better when it comes to end of life. And I can tell you, if you read obituaries in the Sunday paper, you see writings like, he went to be with the Lord. These of course are Christian obituaries. He went to be in the loving arms of Jesus. And you can immediately sense that there was a sense of acceptance that made the transition, that made losing this person a little easier. So I encourage that. Little thing about the rights of the dying. They have the right to participate in decisions. They have a right to expect continuing care, even when change from cure to comfort goals. They have a right to be free of physical pain. They have children have a right to participate in death and the process of death, as well as the right to die, and the right to die in peace and dignity. I will tell you that doctors out there do a very poor job in having end-of-life conversation with patients and family, even though Medicare does offer payment for this during an office visit. Some of you may already know this. So we, as ER doctors, are often required to have the conversation with patients and their family in a less than ideal, often crisis situation. Often when the patient is obviously at death's door, or already comatose or semi-comatose. Here's an example of a 94-year-old woman with dementia who was brought to the ER from a nursing home with pneumonia. She's not responsive. She's doing very poorly. No advance directives. And the 2 daughters are at odds as to what treatment they desire for mom. One daughter says, we can't let mom die, do everything. Another daughter says, you know, she told me once that she really never wants to be on a respirator. This happens way more often than you can imagine. And that's me on the right side of the screen, throwing my arms up in the air in a very difficult situation. And many physicians are just uncomfortable and poorly trained to have a conversation. And we are also guilty of giving patients and families false hope. This is intellectually dishonest and unacceptable. But a little good news, too much bad news, a little good news for you. There's ample opportunity to get better, more comfortable, more educated in having the conversation. And this way, conflict management can be addressed ahead of time. More good news, there are currently over 100 ER doctors here in America who have either taken or completed a fellowship in palliative and hospice care, and their numbers are growing. So, as I said earlier, I'm not a maverick. Many hospitals have vibrant palliative care programs with family conferences with a palliative care team, including a patient who's been in the ICU for more than 3 days who looks like they're not going to make it. The palliative team comes and talks to the patient and family about goals of care. These are some of the helpful phrases that physicians are being taught and having a conversation. Seems to me that you or your dad or your mom are having a really difficult time and are suffering. That's a nice way to introduce it.
Different situation.
You have a good understanding of hers or her condition. Would you like to talk about it? What are his, her, or your wishes? If you had your choice, would you prefer to go home rather than stay in the hospital? I can tell you, I ask patients this all the time in the ER when it's a gray situation about whether they should be admitted or go home. And many of them will say, I don't want to stay in the damn hospital. I want to go home. And we make that happen. And we find a way to safely discharge them in a comfortable and dignified way. Would you like more help to relieve your symptoms?
Still tripping. Yeah. Okay.
What does this all mean to me? A dignified death. Autonomy for as long as possible. Autonomy is so important. Death on my own terms. Making peace by apologizing, asking for forgiveness, and repairing fractured relationships. Oh my goodness, this is so important. We all deserve an opportunity to do this and leave behind a legacy that is not filled with regrets. I never want to be a burden on my loved ones. And I want to be grateful for the wonderful life that I've lived. How about you? What does it mean to you? A quick word about the COVID-19 epidemic. We're almost close to the end. It came out of nowhere. It caught us off guard with our pants down. It created an unforeseen, horrible, unthinkable trail of devastation. Hundreds of thousands of people entered the past year having no idea that it would be their last year on earth. My observation about helping out in the ICU at one of the hospitals I work at, numerous patients who I saw on ventilators would likely have declined aggressive and futile care. They high percent end up dying, had they had advanced directives or conversations about their wishes. This has created an enormous, unprecedented burden on ICU beds and ventilators. You people saw all this in the news over and over again. And yes, it happened here in Phoenix too. The physicians and nurses exhausted, fatigued, and burnt out, having trouble just staying afloat. And death crept up so unexpectedly. To me, the pandemic has been the most sobering reminder I've ever witnessed of the need to have the conversation and advance directives. What a wake-up call. This is the book. It has, for those of you who are interested in buying it, there's a little chapter on the COVID situation. There's a little chapter here at the end where I talk about some real life examples and give a little quiz. Talk about things like a good death is doable, and it's fairly light reading. Of course, it's serious reading, but I was very proud that we wrote the book, and I could tell you my mother would be proud too. Something good came out of her journey with Alzheimer's. I will tell you, my cousin, Dr. Bob Shapiro, has his own website called livesaremeaningful.com, in which he will counsel people by Zoom who have difficult end-of-life decision-making. And he's fabulous at this as well. He's older than I am, but he's a pretty sharp cookie. He's also a very gifted pianist, but that's another story. Thank you so much for your time. This is my contact information, either by Gmail or by cell phone. And at this point, I think it's time to go to Q&A or discussion or storytelling or whatever is on your mind. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, by the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was just so well done, and truly to hear from a subject matter expert such as yourself is helpful and thought-provoking, I know, to every single one of us. So questions, comments, Myra Baum.
Okay, Dr. Molk, this was marvelous. Could you please put your email in the chat or somewhere where we can email you?
Certainly, I'm doing it right now to all.
Thank you. And then I have other things to say. Your book is available, I believe?
Yes, it's available on Amazon. Make sure I put it in correctly. Yeah, you can click on gmail.com, sorry. It's available on Amazon, and it's available in Kindle or in a regular book form. And I will tell you there are many other books, outstanding books out available on this topic as well, written by many brilliant people. Mine is just a little bit unique in the sense that it comes from the perspective of an emergency physician, and for someone who personally experienced, a parent who had dementia.
Let me say also, having read many books on this subject, including yours, that one of the things that I think makes yours special, and not to be insulting, but is the brevity and the directness of the writing. You can read Being Mortal, you can read When Breath Becomes Air, you can read Finish Strong. Those are just some of the other books that I have found very important and meaningful. But I love the fact that you address the subject with such clarity and conciseness. So I think that's helpful to people who don't want to read a whole gadilla. They just want, what's the bottom line?
Thank you, Rabbi. It's so funny you should talk about Being Mortal. I remember when it first came out, it was my wife was reading the New York Times, and then she noticed that this book is on New York Times bestseller list, and she said to me, "I'm sorry to tell you this, Alan, but someone has beaten you to the punch." So I said, "Okay, let me read the book," and I was kind of pleasantly surprised at much of what about what is written in that book, Being Mortal, was in many ways similar to what I wrote. And then I said to Laura, "You know what? You're right. I was beaten to the punch. However, people keep publishing cookbooks all the time, even though The Joy of Cooking was written." So this topic is very much, it's a topic that's never going to go away. And I vowed that if I could make a difference in just a couple of people's lives, that this would have been, that I've made a difference, and my mother would be smiling down. And yeah, that's the joy I get from it, So that's my story there.
Thank you. And Myra, you said you had a few other comments?
Yes, thank you. Is there,
Frank, you'll be next.
Is there some place that I can go to, besides sending the book to my children, that I can encourage my children to talk to me? That I don't know if you've come across this, Dr. Molk, but my children don't talk to me. I'd like to share with them just simple facts, like I had high blood pressure and I went on food rather than medication. I don't even know if they read my emails with this information. And I'd love to share that information with everybody, for instance.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you'd like, you could email me, or I could email you if you want to give me your email address, and I can give you a lot more information. Or if you want to give me your phone number, I'll be happy to talk to you as well, and give you some useful pointers with some of the issues you're having with your children, and try and bridge the gap there, and try and find common ground, because it's definitely doable. It's definitely doable.
My late husband was in hospice, and I begged them to give him extra morphine or something to do away with him. I know that sounds funny, but he was suffering. He couldn't talk. He could just lay there. And it's your talk just now today really hit home. Thank you.
Ira, what you bring up right now, what I call storytelling, is every bit to me as powerful and as compelling as the presentation itself, because you are giving a real life example of exactly what this whole discussion is about the suffering that family and loved ones experience and how there's a better way to do it. So yeah, I'd love to continue the discussion with you separately. So if you'd like to, you can email me or find a way to touch base and continue the conversation. Happy to do so.
Thank you.
And Myra, I just want to underline that it's a genuine challenge. You're not alone in expressing this concern that people try to speak with their children frankly, and the kids don't want to hear it. Oh, you're going to live forever. That's a common response that I hear. Oh, let's not talk about it. You know, you're young, you're healthy, you're going to live forever. Frank, you had a comment?
Yeah, very, very quick. We had the, I guess, privilege of contacting palliative care specialists who in the Valley were very responsive, very informative. And I knew about palliative care and, in retrospect, probably should have contacted him probably sooner, given what we experienced. And I was amazed that these individuals are so specialized in their field. When we just talk, sometimes palliative care sounds kind of general, but these individuals are very specific in the type of care and their recommendations and resources. So,
thank you, Frank. Another great example of great storytelling and very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
So I have a question I'd like to pose. I heard you use the term burden, that we don't want to become a burden. And as a rabbi, I know that the prejudice of the Jewish tradition has long been in favor of life, choose life, certainly not to allow what we would now call medical aid in dying or any intervention that might hasten a death. So the Jewish approach historically has been, we don't need to do anything to intervene to extend life, but we are not permitted to hasten the end, which is often a very, very fine line and comes down to how the question is posed. So I just want to ask you, Dr. Molk, when you talk about being a burden, one of the concerns that I have is, when does the right to die become the obligation to die? You know, we're addressing a scenario that says we each have the right to make a choice for ourselves. We should communicate that choice, and that choice should be respected. And it's a very jarring statistic when we see the percentage of healthcare dollars that are spent at the end of life. We know that that is unsustainable. The question becomes, you know, are we going to move towards a model of medical rationing and denial of care at certain ages in order to alleviate the burden? So if we have a right to choose to let go, do we have a parallel right to choose that we do want extreme means?
oh my God.
A very tough question that I'll answer in little bits and pieces. I will tell you, for example, in the UK, where that has a two-tiered system, the national healthcare system, and the few can afford private insurance, that, for example, dialysis over 70 is the cutoff point. That's how it's rationing. It is absolutely rationing, and is that way in other countries too that have the two-tiered system of both the national healthcare plan And I think New Zealand's the same way. I believe Australia is, and maybe even Canada. But it is such a slippery slope, Rabbi, because you're at the crossroads of medicine, law, ethics, religion, and there's probably another crossroads, but it is, all I can say is every case has to be looked at in its own individual merit. It's so hard, if not impossible, to come up with sort of a blank statement about this, because it's way too controversial, it's not scientific enough, and it's so personal that you're asking this fabulous question and there is no fabulous answer.
I just wanted to put that out there as a concern.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely a concern.
Other questions or comments?
Sandra.
Yes.
Your presentation was very, very good, and we really appreciate all the information. In your book, one of the examples that you gave about an 80-some-odd-year woman who had, or a man, I don't remember, had congestive heart failure and other things, and that was my mom. She had congestive heart failure for years. And so, she'd be on medicine, it was maintained, and, I never thought of it as at some point getting to a point where it couldn't be maintained. And even the doctors seemed to have a problem knowing when they just couldn't. I mean, they'd fix her when she'd be inside and then she'd be let out of the hospital or even the inpatient hospice facility. And then she suddenly, was back where she was like 2 days ago. And so, that was a hard lesson to learn. And, I never really looked at certain diseases that were maintained that suddenly couldn't be maintained. And I thought it was very interesting.
Thank you for sharing that, Sandra. Now, I'll tell you, many physicians just don't know when to say enough. They just, they're not comfortable. It makes them feel awkward. It makes them feel like a failure. And that's why this ongoing education, and it's a huge educational process that needs to be, in my view, that needs to be addressed both at the layperson level and at the educated people level, because the topic still remains somewhat taboo. And, people still want to sweep it under the rug, but very little good comes of doing so. Almost you've got to become a little brutally honest. And that's not easy.
May I ask one specific question? We've been spending, as you know, a lot of time on advanced directives. And I agree with everything that you've said today, about certain things I would not want to have happen, certain quality of life issues. Do you ever, in your own, is there a time, any situation where you would recommend ventilators or other extraordinary measures for older people?
Well, again, each case has to be looked at on its own individual merit and its own individual circumstances. And the answer that actually is not that complicated. It's when you have some reasonable good feel, not just gestalt, but also evidence-based, that person has a reasonably good chance to recover and still maintain an acceptable quality of life that would be acceptable to that person. And when you see a potentially, when I use the word reversible situation, like not all forms of pneumonia are fatal. COVID is fatal in a high percent of people, but there are certain forms of pneumonia that you treat people with antibiotics and you treat them with supportive care. You may have to put them on a ventilator to maintain their oxygenation. They can come off the ventilator and do well. But again, you have to, on the other hand, if that person is someone who already has cancer, already has advanced Lou Gehrig's disease, that person I would not recommend to go on a ventilator. I would absolutely recommend comfort care. You have to look at every person, their own individual merits, what comorbidities they have, what other issues they have, and always make sure that you respect their wishes. Some people will actually say, I've had enough. And I've seen doctors not respect that, and families insist, like Rabbi Capel said, we cannot let mom die, we can't handle that. And that is a whole separate discussion.
Thank you so much. You know, it really helps to hear you explain that balancing, because trying to write this down ahead of time, you can't write it all down because you don't know where you're going to be at the time. So
And you underestimate yourself. You're a lawyer. You're a very sharp lady yourself. Don't undersell yourself. Thank you for that feedback, by the way. And those are good questions.
Yes, Marie, I think you're going to be the last formal question, and just a deep debt of gratitude for Dr. Molk, not only doing this presentation, but making himself available to our individual ongoing concerns. You're very, very generous with your time, and we appreciate that.
It's my mitzvah for the day, Rabbi. Every day deserves a mitzvah.
Yes, Marie. We can't hear you, Marie.
Unmute.
That was an excellent presentation. Enough straightforward and enough embellishment to give us a real flavor. You know, you did a good balance between the two. I had a question last week when we were talking about between, are there nasal prongs and next is ventilator, or is there something in between?
Well, there are many different forms in which you can oxygenate, give somebody adequate oxygenation, which of course is necessary to sustain life. You ideally want oxygen levels to be over 90%, ideally over 94%, most ideally in the 97 to 100% range. But when supplemental oxygen is needed, either temporarily or on a long-term basis, you have nasal prongs, which is the easiest for the person to tolerate. Then you have a mask, which is not so pleasant to tolerate, especially for people who have claustrophobia. And then, of course, there's more aggressive forms of treatment. There's CPAP, which is used for people with sleep apnea. There's BiPAP, which is the step before you put a tube down somebody or intubate them. But the most well-tolerated is nasal prongs. You either give that at 2 or 4 liters a minute. And many people can tolerate that. You often will see people in the mall or in the supermarket walk around with a portable oxygen supply with nasal prongs, and they get used to it and tolerate it quite well and can still have a good quality of life. I hope that answers your question.
So does intubation always imply ventilator?
Oh, yes. In order to intubate somebody, the first thing you got to do is, you cannot tolerate it. Just imagine someone trying to take a fairly thick plastic tube, lift up your jaw, and then shove it into your trachea. You cannot tolerate it because it's considered a foreign body. In order to intubate somebody, you have to A, sedate them, and B, give them a paralytic agent so they don't fight you. It wears off fairly quickly. And then once they're on a ventilator, you've got to keep them constantly sedated because their natural instinct is to want to pull it out, which of course will be very counterproductive. But most people on ventilators, you hope they come off it soon in a matter of 1 to 3 days. But some people, of course, don't, and then end up with a tracheotomy because you cannot stay with intubated indefinitely. And that is a whole separate discussion.
Well, not for today, but thank you so much once again. I hope you're seeing all of the appreciative comments in the chat from folks who had to leave early. Myra shared her phone number and email as well. And I wish everyone a Chag Sameach, a joyous and liberating holiday.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank Alan, thank you so much. It was wonderfully done.
Very
And
good.
I have the old edition, which you so nicely
I gave you a signed copy. Yeah, my pleasure.
signed for me.
Well, it should be something we should embrace, even though it's not a necessarily fun read, but as I say, it's a necessary read for many people who want to avoid the subject. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.